Hi, everybody, I guess. Welcome to Centralism, the podcast that asks how we can take power out of the hands of icky normal people and give it to our benevolent federal politicians. I'm your host and April Fool's aficionado, Petkoff. In today's episode, the 100% legal and 200% fun way we could get rid of all this annoying state and local government nonsense and just have Congress govern everything directly. Now, I'm aware that some of you may have tuned in to listen to Blunchley and that horrible Localism podcast that's all about putting power in the right places and local empowerment and direct democracy and a whole bunch of other really horrible ideas. Well, too bad. This is the Centralism Podcast, and here we don't want power to the people. We don't want all this stupid, slow, inefficient accountability and popular will shit that gets in the way of progress. No, we're all about putting as much power as possible into the hands of a chosen few to rule on our behalf, just as our beloved founding fathers intended. Our brave federal congressmen are doing their best on our behalf, and we just need to get out of their way so their vision for America can finally proliferate. As it happens, there's a beautiful, blessed place in America already where Congress reigns supreme. It doesn't have to worry about such obstacles like local government or fairness. This episode is going to be all about that wonderful, magical place and how we could expand that place so that it runs all the way up to your front door. Let's dive in. Alright, so here's a question that you've maybe run into a couple of times on that horrible, stupid podcast Localism. How does the American system of government work? Well, we've got all these levels of government, state, local, federal, whatever. How do they interact? Fortunately for us, the wise and well-written federal laws are the tippy-top law of the land. So the federal government's rules are the ones that matter here in our country. All the state and local laws are subservient. They get preempted, which is obviously great, because state and local governments are far stupider than the federal government. Well, okay, there is that annoying little bit in the 10th Amendment about how all power is not given to the feds, stay with the states, or with the people, which was a very dumb inclusion if you asked me. We should just assume the federal government can do stuff unless it says otherwise. The result of this silly little carve-out is that unless there's a specific authorization somewhere in the Constitution or in a law, there are a few areas where state and local governments get to do stuff free of federal interference. I know what you're thinking. That's so annoying. Now, if you're like me and love our federal government and hate all these stupid smaller governments getting in the way, you might spend your nights tossing and turning and thinking about how we could just circumvent those annoying state and local governments altogether. How can we get rid of their authority? How can we make sure that the federal government has full and total control? And it was on such a terrible tossing and turning night that I had a great idea. See, there is a beautiful and flawless city upon a hill, a place of joy and wonder and gold-paved streets. In this beautiful American city, there is no obstructionist state government because there is no state at all. There is technically a local government, but only because the federal government patted this place on the head and said, you can have a little local autonomy as a treat. And at any time, the feds could choose to pass a law getting rid of that local government. Yes, this American paradise, beloved and admired from coast to coast, is none other than Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is, let's say, a unique presence in America. It famously is not a state, nor is it subject to any state laws. It is instead a federal district, a term that comes right out of the Constitution. Specifically, it comes out of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution, the so-called Enclave Clause. Ooh, an enclave. You know good shit is happening when it's happening in an enclave. Anyway, under the Enclave Clause, the federal Congress has the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by session of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States. Let's break that down bit by bit. The exercised exclusive legislation language means that in the District of Columbia, or DC, it's Congress that makes all the rules. No balancing, no need to figure out how preemption works, no 10th Amendment concerns. Congress has the exclusive ability to legislate and rule over DC. So far, so good, am I right? But then things from here take a bit of an annoying turn. Not exceeding 10 miles square. Not exceeding 10 miles? We can't give Congress absolute authority beyond this 10-mile postage stamp? Boo. And then there's this last stinger. Where does the land for DC have to come from? Well, by cession of particular states and acceptance of Congress. So basically, in order to have land be part of DC, it needs to be given over by the states, which is actually what happened in history. Maryland and Virginia combined to donate 10 miles of land for a federal capital. Originally, DC was perfectly square. Nowadays, it's sort of like a rectangle with a ragged western edge because the federal government gave Virginia back all the land Virginia had originally donated to DC, meaning that just the donated parcel from Maryland remains, and the Potomac River serves as the western border between Virginia and DC.
All right, dropping my stupid little April Fool's bit for a minute. First of all, it's incredibly alarming how much more Chad-like my voice sounds when it's being put through a filter, and how much like a child I sound when I am no longer putting that effect on my voice, but whatever. The story of the feds sending Virginia back its land from D.C. is actually kind of fucked. The land was returned to Virginia in the 1840s. The lead up to the return was driven by pro-slavery people who lived in Alexandria, which is this Virginia suburb of D.C. today, and at the time was both a town within the district and a huge slave trading hub. These pro-slavery people saw the writing on the wall and were worried that the federal government was going to ban slavery within D.C. So they went whining to the Virginia state legislature to say, hey, can we leave the district so we can keep making money off of stealing people and putting them in chains? And this somehow worked. The Virginia state government went to the feds and said, please give us back our land so we can keep doing slavery, and that's just what Congress did. The slavers' fears proved partially true when in 1850 Congress passed a law forbidding the slave trade in D.C., but failing to outright ban it. Then we had a civil war, and slavery went away forever, hopefully, thankfully, but Virginia wasn't interested in giving land back to D.C. Anyway, just wanted to shed some light on that really sordid little piece of D.C.'s history.
Now, where did I leave off? Right. DC is awesome because it lets Congress do pretty much whatever it wants. But the silly Constitution limited DC's size and made it so land has to be donated by the state legislature in order to be part of DC. Very stinky. But don't worry, I have a plan to make sure that Congress's glorious reign can be extended and the annoyances of state and local governments be stamped out by simply extending DC's borders to cover most of the country. It'll be tricky, to be sure, but if you just follow my program, soon we can all be living inside of DC, safe in the warm embrace of Congress's absolute authority. Call it the DC from sea to sea plan. And the goal of this plan is basically to destroy the influence of non-federal governments by placing most or all of America within the District of Columbia and thus giving Congress near total authority everywhere. Doesn't this already seem like a great idea? I can practically hear the applause coming through the internet.
So step one of DC from sea to sea is going to have to be getting rid of that pesky little bit in the Constitution about limiting DC to 10 miles. Like, literally just get the U.S. to pass a constitutional amendment that crosses out that bit of text and the enclave clause. So consulting the old How to Amend the Federal Constitution handbook will see there are two paths to propose an amendment and two paths to pass that amendment. Proposal is done either by having 2/3 of both halves of Congress propose an amendment, or by 2/3 of states applying to Congress to call for a nationwide constitutional convention. Since DC from sea to sea would expand Congress's power a lot, it'd probably have the most support there, so let's assume our amendment crossing out the 10-mile limit gets proposed by Congress. Then the amendment can be ratified, either by 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of special ratifying conventions in the states. We're agnostic about which of these we do, just whichever we think is going to give us the better chance of success. Now, how are we going to convince states to agree to a change that we're ultimately going to use to try and grow DC and reduce the power of state and local governments, especially when those state legislatures may be the ones voting to approve our constitutional amendment expanding the size of DC? Well, put a pin in that for just a second. You'll see when we get a little further along that there's several ways to convince state governments to cede their territory to the growing DC, and see DC from sea to sea, ooh, that's a lot of C's, as a good idea.
Speaking of ceding territory, even after we've gotten rid of that pesky 10-mile area limit on DC, we'll still have that restriction in there saying that land can only be added to DC if it is voluntarily handed over by state governments to the federal government. That means that DC from sea to sea is premised on states agreeing to go, sure thing, Mr. Federal Government, here you go, please take our land. Why would states ever do that? Well, I have a few ideas of how we could get states to hand over land to DC. Let's start with a fun one, to punish political enemies within a state. Specifically, I'm thinking of blue cities and otherwise Republican states. Remember, nothing in the Constitution says that DC has to be contiguous. You can add territory from here and there and everywhere, including some random city halfway across the country. So picture this. You're the Republican governor of a purple state during a time where the Republicans are in charge of Congress and the presidency. Think like a Georgia or North Carolina situation, depending on the year. But fuck, dude. The polls are in for the next round of state elections, and it looks like a blue wave is on the horizon. Driven by really good projected turnout in Atlanta and some moderate suburban moms pissed off about shit the Republicans are doing on the federal level, your entire Georgia Republican state admin is about to get kicked out, resulting in a generational win for the Democrats. You could, of course, just allow this to happen as a reflection of popular will and public choice and all that dumb shit that we don't actually believe in. But you and your Republican buddies in Congress hatch a devious little scheme to avoid this outcome. Georgia residents wake up a couple months before the state elections to learn some startling news. In a lightning speed set of legislative moves, the Georgia state government has just voted to convey the entire city of Atlanta to the federal government to serve as part of the District of Columbia. There's nothing in the Constitution about how this conveyance needs to occur. Nothing in the Constitution saying that the land that's part of DC has to be contiguous. Nothing in the Constitution saying there's a limit on how big DC can be because we got rid of that part. And certainly nothing in the Constitution about needing to hold a popular referendum or whatever to figure out whether the people living in a place actually want to be part of DC. Nope, all it says is by cession of particular states and acceptance of Congress. Well, Georgia just ceded all of Atlanta. And a couple weeks later, in a closely divided vote, Congress accepts Atlanta as part of DC. Thanks to this little maneuver, Atlanta is no longer part of Georgia. It cannot vote in state elections. It is not within any state. And with that liberal base of power removed, Republican control of Georgia is basically guaranteed for centuries. Sure, maybe Democrats take back the federal government eventually and try to undo Atlanta being part of DC, but presumably they'd have to get the Georgia state government to agree to take Atlanta back, and a conservative-dominated state government would never agree to do that. That's one reason why state governments might give up some of their territory to be part of DC, and approve the idea of expanding DC beyond its current borders, solidifying state-level political power and getting rid of annoying regions that tend to go against your party in state elections. Let's take a similar reasoning and apply it on a federal level now. Suppose that you're the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania and a presidential election is quickly approaching. A highly unpopular Democrat is currently president of the U.S. and she'll be running for her second term. As ever, the pollsters are hard at work spinning their bullshit, and they're convinced that this presidential election is going to be extremely tight. In fact, it's so tight that the perennial swing state Pennsylvania could end up being the deciding factor. So you get a call from one of your Democrat power brokers, one of those power behind the throne types. He makes it clear that the National Party has an idea of how to tilt the scale in favor of Dems in the upcoming presidential election, and your help is expected, or your career in politics will be over forever. So you obey. You get your Dem-controlled state legislature to vote to convey the vast majority of Pennsylvania's conservative northern counties to be part of D.C. The Dem-controlled Congress accepts the conveyance shortly thereafter. This is a really clever, really nasty little maneuver on your part. For one, it gets rid of annoying political opponents on the state level, ensuring Democrat control of Pennsylvania maybe forever. But more importantly, it basically guarantees that Pennsylvania's electoral college votes will go to the Democratic candidate for president. In 2024, Trump won Pennsylvania by less than 200,000 votes. You just kicked significantly more than that number of people out of the state by conveying the conservative counties to D.C. And Pennsylvania is a winner-take-all electoral college state, so Pennsylvania is not going to be a Democratic stronghold for presidential elections for forever now. And in an era of tight presidential elections, painting Pennsylvania permanently blue may just be enough to paint the American presidency permanently blue. Meanwhile, D.C. is limited by the 23rd Amendment to have just 3 stinky little electoral college votes, which, sure, might not lean conservative thanks to adding all these conservative people to the district, but pales in comparison to Pennsylvania's 19 electoral college votes, which might go down a bit thanks to the population loss by handing some state territory over to D.C. But on the other hand, D.C. leans so liberal as it currently exists that adding those conservative counties might not necessarily put those 3 electoral college votes at threat in the first place. The best thing about this is that because the 23rd Amendment sets a hard cap on the amount of electoral college votes D.C. gets, you could theoretically cram as many people and political opponents as you want into D.C., and the number of electoral college votes available to D.C. won't change. All you're doing is just quarantining everyone you don't like into a federal district where their votes for president won't matter. At most, you'd be risking losing just 3 electoral college votes. You can see why the incentive for a national party to start chopping off pieces of a state to hand to D.C. and thus to Congress would therefore be massive if we can just get rid of that pesky 10-mile limitation. Of course, you need to control the presidency and Congress to get it done, which might not happen. So already we've got 2 great ways to start enacting D.C. from sea to sea and start putting as much of America under Congress's direct rule as possible. But there are other ways too, ways I'll briefly breeze over. You could use Congress and the presidency to basically threaten a state into giving over part of its territory to D.C., saying you'll cut its federal funding if it doesn't hand over some part of its land. Imagine, for example, a conservative admin going to California saying, you're oppressing your northern counties and refusing to let them leave your state, you're gerrymandering them so their votes don't matter, so unless you convey them to D.C., which our conservative Congress controls, we are cutting absolutely all of your federal funding. Alternatively, you could posture it as kind of a friendly thing. Hey, fellow conservative governor with a liberal city that's on fire because of protests. Are you having some trouble getting this thing under control? Are you worried that state law is kind of handcuffing you a little bit from taking the measures you really want to? Hey, just hand it over to us. Make it part of D.C. and the feds and all of our nasty resources can take care of it. Hey, liberal state that is a super blighted or abandoned area and is having trouble revitalizing it. Let D.C. take it off your hands. Save yourself the trouble and the tax dollars and the political accountability. Congress can handle it. And these things have a kind of momentum to them. When one state starts chopping itself up and handing over the pieces to D.C., there will be others that follow. Month by month, year by year, D.C. will swell and the states will shrink. Soon, the situation we have right now, D.C. as a tiny little 10-mile island in the middle of a sea of state land, will be reversed. D.C. will swallow most of America, with perhaps only a few state capitals or little corners here and there remaining state territory. And America totally and completely under the control of our federal Congress. What a wonderful America that would be. One last thing before we close the book on this absolutely brilliant idea. Some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I feel like I've read stories about like the DC city government or even someone called the DC mayor. I thought that Congress had complete control of DC. Why are these little local seeming governments running around? Will that stuff still be there and all these new pieces of territory we're adding to DC? Sounds like a recipe to have a bunch of local governments getting in the way of the rightful direct rule of Congress. Not to worry, my little DC from sea to sea enthusiast. It's true that there is nominally a DC mayor and a DC city government and a DC city council and what have you. But the only reason that stuff exists is because of the DC Home Rule Act, a federal law passed in 1973 under which Congress decided to delegate some of its power to a new city government. For you disgusting local authority aficionados, first off, turn off this podcast right away. We don't like things like local authority or the public will in these parts. But second of all, you can kind of think of this as Congress setting up the equivalent of a Dillon Rule scheme in D.C. The Home Rule Act was kind of like a state government passing a law that becomes a city charter. D.C.'s local government has absolutely no inherent authority. Anything it does is just a delegation from Congress that Congress can at its leisure decide to withdraw at any time. Congress could wake up tomorrow and simply repeal the Home Rule Act, making the district once more have no government other than Congress itself. So don't worry, the Home Rule Act will be no impediment to direct congressional rule of our gigantic D.C. Hell, if we wanted to, we could even pass other laws like the Home Rule Act, creating other little city governments across the country. Congress is busy, and it's annoying to do things like local zoning decisions or filling potholes or what have you. Why not simply create federal law local governments to handle the boring day-to-day stuff, and then keep them in line with the ever-present threat of Congress repealing their charters and returning to direct rule? Just some food for thought. Of course, it should go without saying that these federally created city or territorial governments would absolutely not enjoy any protection from the 10th Amendment, would not wield any power except what Congress saw fit to hand down from on high, and any crumbs of self-rule Congress did deign to delegate could be withdrawn instantly if a local government did something to piss Congress off. Like I said, basically a dual enroll system, but established via federal law. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this little peek into a future of direct federal congressional rule via DC from C to C. Alas, our time together is limited. With April Fool's soon to end, so too will the Centralism Podcast until perhaps April of next year. I suspect that dipshit Blunchley and his shitty localism podcast will be back again in the next couple of weeks. Just checking my notes here. It seems he's left a little note that I'm supposed to read. Happy April Fools. Hope you enjoyed this change from our normal programming. Blah, blah, blah. Let's just skip to the end. Okay, here we go. We've talked a lot on the Localism Podcast about local government and this idea of democratization. But we haven't done as good a job as needed looking at the current state of small R Republican local elections and the way it warps our politics. Tune in next time for an episode all about what participation in local elections looks like and how it elevates some people at the expense of others. Local elections? Ugh, sounds disgusting to me. But if that floats your perverted little boat, you can check out the Localism Podcast on Spotify or on its YouTube channel at LocalistPod, that's Localist with a T, pod. If long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then Localism also does these horrible 3-minute long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And because that idiot Blunchley and his dumbass podcast are too woke for Twitter or something, you can also check them out on Blue Sky. Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send Blunchley an email at localistpod. Again, that's localist with a T, pod, at gmail.com. You're also welcome to submit a question or comment via the form on www.localistpod.net. Funny, all my constructive criticism seems to get ignored, but hopefully you guys will have better luck than I have. See you next year, Centralism Truthers.
A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.